Right, so I'm going to be deviating slightly from the book of Revelation, although still sticking with prophecy, but this is something that is topical, and I thought I'd address this question as to should true Christians support Israel or not, especially in light of current events with the terrorist attack that there's been on Israel, with a brutal killing of children, beheading of babies, raping of women, and yet most of the world, including our government, immediately jumps to the defense of the oppressed people in Gaza, and no one seems to care about the fact where Jews get beheaded or raped. But we just want to see what the Bible has to say in the light of current events. Our ANC-led government backs the Palestinian cause. I won't say South Africans back it, but our government does. They established formal diplomatic relations in 1995, but in 2019 they actually downgraded our embassy in Tel Aviv to a liaison office, and they didn't replace the ambassador. Our ambassador is back in South Africa, and we will not be replacing him, said International Relations Minister Lindiwe Sisulu. And they went on to say that our office there will have no political mandate, no trade mandate, no development cooperation mandate. It will not be responsible for trade and commercial activities. There was a petition signed by 60,000 South Africans saying that our ambassador should be reinstated and we shouldn't downgrade the embassy. And the voice of the people was once again ignored. And that is still the state of affairs today. So should true Christians be supporting Israel or not? We looked at covenants some time ago, and if you remember the covenant with Abraham, who was the forefather of the Jewish nation, in Genesis 12, verse 1 to 3, this is just one of the passages. There's multiple passages, but let me just read this one because it covers all three aspects of this covenant. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth will be blessed." So there's three aspects to that covenant. God promises three main things: a source of blessing to the nations, that Abram would have descendants and a great nation, and then land. And we'll look at that one last. So firstly, a source of blessing to the world. I want to tell you that Israel is a blessing to the world. Many Jews live by a motto, Tikkun Olam, which is save the world, and they committed to making the world a better place. And God has used these people to be a light to the nations. Of the 954 Nobel Prizes that have been awarded from 1901 to 2022, 22% have gone to Jews, even though they constitute such a small part of the world. There have been Jewish recipients of all 6 of the Nobel Foundation's awards. Go have a look at how much some of their enemies have won in terms of international awards. Economics, 40%, physiology or medicine, 26%, physics, 25%. There's just perhaps the most famous Jew up there, Albert Einstein, who also got the Nobel Prize for physics, chemistry, literature, and peace. Israel's gained a reputation as a global leader in medical and digital health system. They've made breakthroughs in the battle against Alzheimer's, cancer, and heart disease. Too much to say there. If you're interested, go look at the footnote there and click on that link, and you can read a whole article just on some of the incredible advances. They ranked 6th in the 2022 World Index of Healthcare Innovation, and its hospitals and health fund are considered some of the best in the world. And they've been responsible for many of the amazing medical advances, which, as I say, we won't get into here, but if you're interested, go check out that link. They're also a major player in technology innovation. In fact, perhaps only the United States is more prominent globally. Israel has the highest concentration of high-tech companies in the world outside of Silicon Valley, and more scientists and technicians per capita than any other economy. They boast one of the highest numbers of R&D centers per capita in the world, and they're committed to developing technology. They've made major advances in terms of water conservation. They took over a land that was a semi-desert, and it was far from the land flowing with milk and honey described in the Bible, and they've turned it back into that. And with amazing innovation in terms of technology in a land where water isn't plentiful, they produce amazing agriculture. They drained the swamps, launched a massive and ongoing tree planting campaign. Much of the desert has been reclaimed. They've put up kibbutzim there. And they produce fruits, vegetables, and flowers to feed the country and to export as well. Their military, once again, bear in mind, we're talking about a small country here. They always rank in the top 10 in the world. In fact, according to a 2022 US News and World Report, their military ranked 4th in the world behind Russia, the US, and China, which are very, very large countries. Their Air Force is one of the strongest in the world. About a third of the IDF's manpower is in the Air Force. This man over here is an IDF pilot, Giora Epstein. He holds the world record for enemy takedowns. But they also have the most humane military practices, no matter what you may see in the South African press. They're the only military who phone the occupants of buildings before they bomb them and warn them to leave. They use text messages, phone calls, and distribute leaflets. They've even, as we've seen, paused the invasion of Gaza while they wait for civilians to evacuate, unlike Hamas, who actually are trying to stop them evacuating because they like using the supposed people they represent as human shields because it gives them good press. Israel's the safest place for Christians in the Middle East. Now, there is some anti-Christian sentiment from extremists in Israel, but it's not state-sanctioned. But I challenge you to go to any other country in the Middle East and see how Christianity is tolerated there. In most Middle Eastern countries, any person who follows Jesus is persecuted, discriminated against, imprisoned, and at times killed. Not the case in Israel. Since the beginning of the nation, Israel has welcomed Christians and protected them politically. And it's the only country in the Middle East which values the rights of women, refugees, religions, and the press. Look at Saudi Arabia. It was only a couple of years ago that they started allowing women to drive cars. Okay. All nations blessed. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, we are told in the Bible that that goes further than just the blessing that the land of Israel is to the nation. In fact, in Galatians 3, we're told that in particular, the seed of Abraham being a blessing to the world is specifically fulfilled in Jesus, that he was the seed of Abraham, source of blessing to all nations, because he died for both Jew and Gentile to offer us redemption. All nations blessed through Israel. It's from the Jews that we have the Bible, both your Old and New Testament, with the exception of 2 books, the book of Luke and Acts, which are written by a Gentile. The Bible is written by Jews. It's from them we have the prophets, the apostles, and our blessed Redeemer. Romans 3 verse 2 says, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. That's where we got the Bible from. And in Romans 9 verse 4 to 5 says, the people of Israel, theirs is the adoption to sons. Theirs is the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. So that fulfillment of that promise which came through the Jews, ultimately God blesses the world through Jesus, through the seed of Abraham. And then God promised Abraham that his descendants would be a great nation. Now, it's true that other nations came out of Abraham, including the Arabs, but in particular, that Abrahamic covenant, if you know the Bible, was not given specifically to Ishmael. Although God said he had blessed Ishmael, the covenant promises went to Isaac. And the same with Esau and Jacob. Even though we know that nations came out of Esau as well, the covenant promises would go to Jacob, who became Israel. And so Israel became a great nation once they left Egypt. And God promised to protect the nation of Israel. He says to Abram that he will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. That's good enough reason to support Israel. And throughout history, we've seen nations who have cursed Israel, who have persecuted her, come under the judgment of God. Perhaps the most recent in the 20th century with the fall of the Nazi regime, who tried to exterminate the Jews. But that wasn't the only one. If you go read your history, you'll find that throughout history, there have been nations who've persecuted the Jews, come under God's judgment. And so I want to tell you that any nation in the world, including our own, who seeks to harm Israel will face God's wrath. And they bring us under a curse. Not only themselves under a curse, but ultimately us under a curse. A curse on those who curse Israel. The Hadith is a collection of the sayings or traditions of Muhammad. It's used in addition to the Quran, and it's revered by Muslims as a major source of religious law. This is what the Hadith states. It says that the duty of Muslim is to kill Jews in the end time. It says the day of resurrection will not arrive until the Muslims make war against the Jews and kill them. And until a Jew hiding behind a rock and a tree, and the rock and tree will say, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." That's the face of moderate Islam as portrayed in the Hadith, the sacred writings. The Grand Mufti is the highest official in the Sunni variant of Islam. And in 1921, this chap over here, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he used that position, because this was before the state of Israel was declared, to promote Islam and to pursue fiercely anti-Semitic policies. Many people don't know this, but in 1937, the Grand Mufti, who was the representative of the Muslims in what was then Palestine, the British Mandate, expressed solidarity with the Nazis. He asked the Third Reich to oppose the establishment of a Jewish state, to stop Jewish immigration to Palestine and provide arms to the Arab population. There he is meeting with Adolf Hitler. According to the documentation from the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials, Eichmann was the well-known Nazi criminal that they eventually caught in Argentina. The SS helped finance al-Husseini's efforts in the revolt in Palestine. That should be 1936 to 39. Eichmann actually visited Palestine and met with al-Husseini, and they maintained regular contact later. While in Baghdad, al-Husseini aided the pro-Nazi revolt of 1941, and he actually spent the rest of the war as Hitler's guest in Berlin, advocating the extermination of Jews in radio broadcasts back to the Middle East and recruiting Balkan Muslims for the famous SS mountain divisions who tried to wipe out Jewish communities in the region. There he is meeting with the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. At the Nuremberg trials, that was after the war, Eichmann's deputy, Dieter Vissalini, who was subsequently executed as a war criminal, said this: the Mufti it's the Muslim leader of the Arabs in Palestine, was one of the initiators of the systematic extermination of European Jewry and had been a collaborator and advisor of Eichmann and Himmler in the execution of this plan. He was one of Eichmann's best friends and had constantly incited him to accelerate the extermination measures. I heard him say, accompanied by Eichmann, he had visited incognito the gas chamber of Auschwitz. And referring to a meeting that was held between the Mufti and Himmler, a modern Lebanese writer, Gilbert Echar, says this: the Mufti was well aware that the European Jews were being wiped out. He never claimed the contrary, nor, unlike some of his present-day admirers, did he play the ignoble, perverse, and stupid game of Holocaust denial. He didn't deny that there was a Holocaust, like some Muslims do today. In fact, he gloated that the Jews had paid a much higher price in the war than the Germans. Their losses in the Second World War represent more than 30% of the total number of the people. Statements like this from a man who was well placed to know what the Nazis had done constitute a powerful argument against those people today who actually tell you the Holocaust didn't happen. One German officer noted in his journals that the Mufti would have liked to have seen the Jews, all of them preferably killed. On a visit to Auschwitz, he reportedly admonished the guards running the gas chambers to work more diligently. And in September 1943, there were negotiations to rescue 500 Jewish children from a concentration camp, and they collapsed because he objected. He was worried that some of those children might end up in Palestine. He recommended to the Hungarian minister that it would be better to send the Jews in Hungary to concentration camps in Poland rather than let them find asylum in Palestine. A year later, when he certainly knew the details of the Nazi program to destroy the Jews, he wrote to the Hungarian foreign minister to register his objection to the release of certificates for 900 Jewish children and 100 adults for transfer from Hungary, fearing that they might end up in Palestine. So he was directly involved in the fact that the Nazis were able to more effectively kill Jewish children and adults. And so, on March the 1st, 1944, while speaking on Radio Berlin, this is what he said: Arabs, rise as one man and fight for your sacred rights. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. He's quoting the Hadith there. This pleases God, history, and religion. This saves your honor. God is with you. And he was the uncle of Yasser Arafat. And not only his uncle, he was his mentor, something that people don't tell you today. That was the mentor of Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO. In fact, Arafat began his career working for the Mufti and would continue to praise him as late as 2002, which was about 2 years before his death. Now, I've seen many articles where the Palestinians try to distance themselves from the Mufti because of the connections to the Nazis. But apparently these guys never got the memo. So some of the articles you read, they will say we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. But look at that placard, God bless Hitler. This little girl, Jews haven't learned they need the swastika more than before. I'm sure she didn't make the placard, but that's what their parents teach a little child like that. The UN Resolution 181, that was where they called for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. There's David Ben-Gurion. He proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel on May the 14th, 1948, a very important day in prophecy. It was rejected by the local Arab population in the area and the Arab states, and they said they intended to prevent the creation of the Jewish state by all means. The very day he declared the state of Israel, that evening, 5 Arab nations declared war on this newly found state that had hardly any means of defending themselves. And so Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria invaded the new state same night, seeking its annihilation. But if you know the story, this war of independence, the Jews, to the astonishment of everybody, prevailed. Even though they battled to get weapons, no one would supply them with weapons and planes. But there was a heavy cost. 1% of the total population died in the war. At the end of the war, that area there, shown as Jordan, they annexed the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip was annexed by Egypt. Just under the control of Egypt and Jordan. And that West Bank included the old part of Jerusalem. So initially Jordan held the old part of Jerusalem and the whole of the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip was held by Egypt until the Six-Day War. Some 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries, and they found refuge in the new country of Israel. But the Arab population in the Mandate territory of Palestine also suffered, because what happened is their leaders told them to get out. They said, we're going to kill all the Jews, get out. And so 700,000 of them heeded the call and they fled. And what happened is when the Jews unexpectedly won the war, they wouldn't let them back in. Those who stayed became full citizens with equal rights, but those who left, because they were leaving so that the Jews could be killed, and they were hoping to come back and take over their property and possessions, and then they were denied any access back into the country. And the Arab states who had advised them to do this wouldn't take them in either, and rather preferred to keep them as political pawns, and so they kept them in a perpetual state of refugees so that the world would have some cause. The United States has been one of the countries that has consistently supported Israel. And despite all the other problems, God will bless them and has blessed them because of that. In fact, the very day that Ben-Gurion announced the state of Israel, Harry Truman, the president, was the leader of the first country to recognize them. And Israel's the largest cumulative recipient of their foreign aid. Not even factoring in inflation. By February 2022, they had provided Israel with $150 billion in assistance. So what about the Palestinian objectives today? Well, I'm just going to give you one. In Sudan, a mosque in 2007, the acting speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, Sheikh Ahmad Bar, said the following: "You will be victorious while America and Israel will be annihilated. Allah willing. They are cowards who are eager for life, while we are eager for death for the sake of Allah. O Allah, vanquish the Jews and their supporters. O Allah, vanquish the Americans and their supporters. O Allah, count their numbers and kill them all, down to the very last one." These are the people who represent the oppressed people, and the Israelis are, and the Americans are the oppressors, apparently. Now, in the Bible, in Ezekiel 38 to 39, it predicts an end-time alliance of nations who attack Israel. Now, the timing is debated. Some believe it takes place at the start of the tribulation, because it's not mentioned explicitly in the early part of Revelation. And in Ezekiel, it takes 7 months to bury the dead, and it talks about them burning their weapons for 7 years. So that seems to fit in if it was the beginning of the tribulation. However, there are others who believe that it's at the end of the tribulation, and they conflate it with Armageddon, because Armageddon is also an attack on Israel. So we're not too sure about that. But what we do know is that Magog, that's mentioned there, that will lead the alliance, is almost certainly Russia. I won't go into all the details now. We can do it at a later study. There's many reasons for identifying Magog with Russia. But in particular, one of the many reasons in Ezekiel 38, it talks about Magog coming from your place in the far north. There's a Google Maps picture of Jerusalem, and exactly due far north is Moscow. So if you bypass Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, you get to Russia and Moscow. And it talks about them being invaded by a country called Magog, which is identified, as I said, by most with Russia. But what's interesting is the allies that are mentioned: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah. Gomer, there's a bit of uncertainty as to who that can be identified, but all those others are Muslim nations. Iran is Persia. You know who's supplying Hamas and Hezbollah with weapons and money? Iran. Libya, another very anti-Israel country. Cush, although some identified with Ethiopia, in honesty, it's more likely Sudan, and northern Sudan again is Islamic country. And Beth Togarmah is almost certainly Turkey as well. And although Turkey has sort of portrayed themselves as moderates, they're showing more and more the fact that they are no different from any of the other Muslim nations in the recent years. So, the final part, the land. God promised Abraham's descendants land. And according to the promise, it was the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, Israel doesn't have all that land now. There will be a day in the millennium, we believe, where they will have all that land. There's never been a time when they've had all that land, which is one of the reasons why we believe in the literal rule of Jesus from Jerusalem, because God always keeps his promises. God never breaks his promises. And if God promised them all the land from the Nile and the Euphrates, of which Israel is just a subset at the moment, they will get that. So they have that land because of a covenant with God. And they have a right to the land, a right to be a nation, and a right to defend themselves. If you don't believe that, if you don't believe that God keeps his promises, on what basis do you believe that God will keep his promises to Christians? We're also in a covenant relationship with God. If God doesn't keep his covenant with Israel, why should he keep his covenant with us? But we have a God who doesn't lie, who doesn't make promises and then renege on them. And so those who are pro-Palestinian will tell you, well, the Israelis are actually European Jews, and they just trumped up this idea of an identity because they wanted to steal the land, and they actually belong in Europe, and they should go back. Well, I want to tell you the reason they're in Israel and not in Europe is because for years they were persecuted and rejected in Europe as being non-Europeans. And there's just one picture of a Jew in Poland, at the time of the Nazis, being beaten. And the reason they left Europe was because of persecution, and that's why the Zionist movement was started in the first place. Gary sent me this, which had been forwarded to him by some boss that he used to work for, who's a Lebanese guy, who's a Catholic, and who supports the Palestinian cause. And the title was The Shrinking Palestine. So if you look at that, it gives you the impression that from 1946, there was this big area called Palestine, and that in 1947 and 67 and 2010, that Palestine has been shrinking because the Jews have been stealing their land. Well, if you're ignorant of history, it might make sense to some people. Because in 1946, that land was not Palestinian. It was ruled by the British. It was a British mandate. And furthermore, before that, it belonged to Turkey, we'll see. That second map was rejected. That's what the United Nations proposed, how they split the land, and it was rejected by the Palestinians in favor of war. Those green areas there were not Palestine. As I've told you, they were occupied respectively by Jordan and by Egypt, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And in fact, that last one there is the first time there's ever been territories, ever in history, that have been ruled by Palestinians, and they were created by Israel. This is from Wikipedia, a timeline of Jerusalem. And there's a lot of detail there, so I had to split it over a couple of slides. You know that originally that area was called Canaan and belonged to the Canaanites. And the Jews took it from the Canaanites. And you can go throughout history and see how it's changed, not changed hands. It's been under occupation by the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, etc., etc. In Jesus' day, under the Romans. Following that, the Byzantines, etc., etc. There was a time when it was occupied as well by Muslim Arabs. One thing you'll notice, though, there was never a time when it belonged to a group of people called the Palestinians. Go have a look at it. That's from an encyclopedia. There was never a time in history where that land belonged to anyone called the Palestinians. So where did the name come from, Palestine? Well, in the early 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who hated the Jews, he decided to build a new Roman city called Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem had been destroyed in AD 70 by Titus, and there was a bit of a resurgence of Jewish nationalism, and Hadrian suppressed it, and so he even renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. And out of spite and hatred for the Jews, he changed the name of the country to Syria Palestina. So as I say, the very name Palestine was chosen because in the Bible, you'll know the enemies, the mortal enemies of the Israelites. If you read the Old Testament, who's who? The Philistines. And that's where the name Palestine came from. So effectively, the Romans would have called the Jews Palestinians. So the original Palestinian in the Romans' eyes, although the Jews never liked the term and never accepted the term, were actually the Jews. There was never a group of people called the Palestinians. Who are the Philistines? Is there a link between the Philistines and the Palestinians? Not at all. We know that from DNA. They've actually done excavation of the old Philistine cities, in particular in Ashkelon, and they've actually found that the DNA of the original Philistines was European. They actually came from Europe. So they were called the Kaftarim by the biblical writers. And there are many people who believe that they actually came from Crete. They were sea people, and they were probably more closely related to the Greeks than to anyone else. So there, for your information, Delilah and Goliath were actually Europeans. The most famous or infamous Philistines, of course, were Delilah and Goliath. As I was talking now, there's no link between Palestinian and Philistine, despite the name. The link was made by Hadrian, and it was purely because he just liked the Jews, and he knew the Jews didn't like the Philistines. So out of contempt, he called the area Syria Palestina. And so in the Romans' minds, the occupants, the Palestinians, were Jews. They never accepted the name, and ultimately the city also became Jerusalem again when the first Christian emperor Constantine renamed it back to Jerusalem. And that name was a name that was used by the Romans. In fact, the term Palestine or Palestinian was not even used in that document I referred to, that UN resolution. They spoke, and I had a picture of it, and I can show it to you next time. They spoke simply of the Jewish inhabitants and the Arab inhabitants. And so ethnically and culturally, the modern Palestinians, they are ethnically Arab. They've got links not to the Philistines, and that we know this stuff now with DNA. They say the Philistines, we're actually not too sure what happened to them. They seem to have disappeared off the face of the earth, but they were not a Semitic people. They were, as I told you, related to Europeans. And over time, their DNA altered because they intermarried, but there's no link between the Philistines and any modern nation. So it's purely coincidental that the Gaza Strip, Gaza happened to be one of the cities of the Philistines. They're not the Philistines. The other thing that I just want to point out as well, when I actually sent a response to Gary to forward to this friend of his, they then tried to say, well, the reason the British had it was because they stole it from the Arabs. They colonized it from the Arabs. That is not true. They took it from Turkey. And if you know anything, Turks are not Arabs. They might be Muslims, but they are not Arabs. In fact, the Turks, again, are ethnically a Japhetic race. They're not Semitic. Okay, they came from Torgama, who was one of the sons of Japheth. And what happened is in the World War I, the Turks were allies with Germany. They had the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire included all what are the Arab countries today and Israel. And so all the Arab countries, the ones we know today, like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, were actually under the rule of the Turks for centuries. And because the Turks sided with the Germans and then they lost the war, after the war, the Allies split up that territory and they gave countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia to the Arabs, and they gave this tiny little slither of land, which is actually smaller than the Kruger National Park, to the Israelis, because they'd actually promised it, and the British had promised the Israelis in what was called the Balfour Declaration. In return for assistance the Jews gave them during the war, they promised them this territory in Israel, and yet that tiny little slither of land, which is a fraction of the size of what was given to the Arabs, is what is so contested today. But the motivation is not because the land is actually needed. It's because Satan hates Israel and he hates the covenants of God and he wants to try prove God wrong. And so that's why God has promised to bless the Jews, and Satan has tried to destroy them and has used the Russian pogroms and used guys like Hitler and Haman in the past to try to destroy this race, because if he can destroy them, he can disprove God, because God said that your seed will be as many as the stars. And he wants to disprove God in terms of the promises of land that were made to Abraham as well. So in summary, I want to say that God has used Israel, even though Israel at the moment, in large part, are living in, I won't say opposition, but they're not part of the new covenant. And besides the Messianic Jews, many of them don't know or don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. Besides that, God has still used Israel as a blessing to the nations, as I showed you, not only through all they've done technologically, but through the fact that we have the Bible and the heritage of the scripture, and we have the very lineage of our Messiah, Jesus, found in the Jews. And I want to tell you that God's promise that I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you still applies on an individual level, and it still applies to nations. So we tread on very dangerous grounds when we have our president, who's not even able to solve the crime problem we have in our own country, stand up and criticize the Israelis and putting himself forward as the person who can solve the problems in the Middle East. And obviously we feel for those innocent Palestinians as well, who are also used as pawns by Hamas. And we know that the territory also at the moment, they've had their power and facilities all removed. And we have the president of our country who can't keep the power on during peacetime, who wants to arbitrate and solve the problems that I'm saying. I know we respect the office of the president, but I want to tell you that we speak out against evil. And so even though we're told to honor our leaders, when John the Baptist saw Herod committing sin, he spoke out against that sin, and he was basically beheaded because of that. When Elijah, as we saw previously, saw the evil and the wickedness of Jezebel and Ahab, he spoke out and he pronounced God's judgment on them. And so God's word says that if we as a country oppose Israel and curse Israel, we ourselves stand the risk of coming under God's curse. Amen.